On the morning of Wednesday, March 18, 1925, it rained. Not the warm, humid, sun and cloud morning that the conventional understanding of, not the green-tinted sky or the freight train silence that tornado survivors describe as the specific sensory signature of what's coming. It rained. The sky was dark. The air was heavy and still. There was no wind. In Gorham, Illinois, residents who stepped outside that morning saw gray, wet, unpleasant March weather. Rainy and drizzly, with dark and gloomy skies and little wind, as survivors would later recall. In Murfreesboro, Illinois, in West Frankfort, in the small farming towns and mining communities stretched across the southern Illinois coal fields that would bear the largest share of the afternoon's death toll. Nothing in the morning sky said what the afternoon was going to do. This is one of the specific features of the March 18, 1925 atmospheric setup that makes the event distinctive even among catastrophic tornado events. The morning gave no conventional warning. In the standard severe weather pattern that the American public in tornado-prone regions has spent a century learning to recognize, the partly sunny morning giving way to towering afternoon cumulus, the wind shifting, the sky taking on the specific yellowish or greenish cast that experienced observers associate with rotating storms. Nothing of the sort occurred. March 18 in southern Illinois was an overcast, rainy, cold spring day, right up until the moment when something emerged from the southwest that no living person in its path had ever seen and survived. In the farming communities of southeastern Missouri, southern Illinois, and southwestern Indiana that would bear the full weight of what the afternoon would bring, residents who stepped outside that morning and looked at the sky saw nothing that the weather knowledge of 1925 would have told them to fear. What they saw was a gray, wet, unpleasant March day. At approximately 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, something emerged near the town of Ellington in Reynolds County, Missouri. The witnesses describe it differently, as witnesses always do, because the specific position from which you first see a tornado determines what you see. But the recurring elements across the accounts are consistent. A roaring, a darkness that moved, that grew, something that didn't look like what they understood a tornado to look like. Not a narrow funnel descending from a distinct rotating cloud base, but something much larger. Something that occupied the southwestern horizon rather than a point within it. Something that moved toward them faster than they expected anything that large to move. Something that was already very close by the time they understood what it was. What arrived was the tri-state tornado. What left, 3 hours and 30 minutes and 219 miles later, near Petersburg, Indiana, was the deadliest tornado in the recorded history of the United States. It killed 695 people along its path. The other tornadoes that the March 18 outbreak produced, storms that on any other day would themselves have been the story of the season, added another 52 deaths to the afternoon's toll. By 4:30 p.m. on March 18, 1925, 747 people were dead from tornadoes in a single afternoon. The record still stands. No tornado day in American history has killed more, and nobody in the path received a tornado warning. Not because the warning system failed, because the warning system in 1925 was legally prohibited from issuing tornado warnings. The word tornado had been formally banned from United States weather forecasts since the 1880s. The ban was real. It was official. It was the policy of the United States government's meteorological agency. And on March 18, 1925, when the most destructive tornado in American history was moving at 62 miles per hour through towns of thousands of people, the scientific apparatus of the United States government was not permitted to say what it was. This is the story of March 18, 1925, of the tri-state tornado and the 747 people who died in its company, of the 219-mile path that no tornado before or since has equaled, of the forward speed that turned communities into catastrophe zones with minutes of warning at most, of the scientific context that makes this event not just a historical tragedy, but one of the foundational documents in the argument for why tornado warning systems exist, and why the 13-minute average lead time that the modern NWS achieves, imperfect as it is, represents the accumulated knowledge of a century of preventable death. If this kind of deep, real science holds your attention, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Let's begin. The United States in 1925 does not have a tornado warning system. This is not a statement about technological limitation. It is a statement about institutional policy. The American meteorological establishment of the late 19th century, under the leadership of the United States Army Signal Corps and later the United States Weather Bureau, had concluded that issuing tornado forecasts would cause more harm than good. The reasoning was specific. The word tornado, it was argued, would produce panic among the civilian population. Panic would cause stampedes, accidents, and disruption disproportionate to the actual tornado risk. The public could not, in the institutional view of the era, be trusted to respond rationally to tornado information. The ban on the word tornado in official U.S. weather communications went into effect in the 1880s, specifically traceable to policies instituted under the command of Brigadier General Adolphus Greely, who headed the Signal Corps and whose meteorological views were influential in shaping what the Weather Bureau would and would not communicate to the public. The ban was not a soft guideline or an informal convention. It was enforced policy, applied to official forecast and warning communications. Weather Bureau meteorologists who issued tornado forecasts or used the word tornado in official communications did so at professional risk. The institutional culture that the ban created extended beyond the prohibition itself. It produced a forecasting community that was discouraged from studying tornado behavior, from developing the theoretical framework for understanding tornado formation, and from building the institutional knowledge base that operational tornado warning requires. This is one of the more significant self-imposed constraints in the history of applied science in the United States. The ban did not prevent tornadoes from occurring. It did not prevent communities from being struck without warning. What it prevented was the accumulation of institutional knowledge, the development of operational expertise, and the existence of any public expectation that a tornado warning could or should be received before a tornado arrived. For more than half a century, from the 1880s through the 1940s, the United States government's meteorological agency was actively prohibited from doing the thing that would have most directly reduced tornado deaths: warn people that a tornado was coming. The specific argument the Signal Corps and Weather Bureau made for maintaining the ban was never tested against evidence, because the ban foreclosed the possibility of collecting the evidence that would test it. Did tornado warnings cause panic? Nobody knew, because no systematic tornado warning program existed. Did warned populations survive at higher rates than unwarned populations? Nobody knew, because warned populations didn't exist. The ban was based on a theoretical assumption about human psychology that was accepted as institutional doctrine and defended for decades without empirical examination. The ban remained in place in various forms into the 1940s, even after the word tornado was gradually rehabilitated in Weather Bureau communications in the 1930s and 1940s. The operational infrastructure for issuing tornado warnings to the public did not exist until the late 1940s and early 1950s. The result was that the deadliest tornado in American history, the Tri-State Tornado of March 18, 1925, killed 695 people in a 3.5-hour path across 3 states, and not one of those 695 people received any official indication that a tornado was coming, because the official weather agency of the United States government was not permitted to tell them. On March 18, 1925, this policy was still in force. The Tri-State Tornado formed in a specific atmospheric environment that, in retrospect, the weather science of 1925 might have recognized as unusual, even without the specific knowledge of supercell meteorology that would be developed in the decades to come. The mornings, rain, and darkness. The features that struck contemporary witnesses as the specific quality of the day were part of a large-scale weather system that had been in motion for more than 24 hours before the tornado formed. An extratropical cyclone centered over northwestern Montana at Seventuck Am-Seat on March 17, was deepening and moving eastward. A diffuse area of surface low pressure sat near Denver, Colorado, associated with a lee trough, the specific area of low pressure that forms in the wind shadow of the Rocky Mountains, when the large-scale flow pushes air over and around the mountains, rather than directly through them. As the extratropical cyclone moved east, this lee trough developed and intensified. By the morning of March 18, a strong surface low-pressure system was positioned in the central United States, drawing warm, moist air northward from the Gulf of Mexico through Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. The atmosphere on March 18 was layered in the way that severe weather atmospheres are layered. Cold air aloft from the northwest, warm and moist air in the lower levels from the southeast, and a sharp boundary between them. The specific stability profile of the atmosphere, the relationship between the temperature of the air at different heights and the temperature of any air parcel forced upward, created conditions where convection, once triggered, would be explosive. The daylight heating of March 18 provided that trigger. The residents of Gorham, Illinois, who recalled the morning as rainy and drizzly, with dark and gloomy skies and little wind, were describing a specific meteorological reality. The atmospheric setup that produced the Tri-State Tornado was dominated by the large-scale forcing of the extratropical cyclone rather than the surface heating and local boundary layer dynamics that characterize the most common severe weather pattern in the southern Great Plains, the afternoon thunderstorm buildup along the dry line. The Tri-State Tornado's parent storm was organized and powered by a different mechanism, the forced ascent of warm, moist air ahead of an upper-level trough, a synoptic scale feature that produced convection in the morning's rain and overcast rather than in the afternoon's sunshine and cumulus development. This difference in forcing mechanism is directly related to the absence of warning. The conventional expectation of tornado weather, the partly sunny, windy morning with rising dew points and an afternoon that turns threatening, does not apply to a synoptically forced outbreak in which the large-scale weather system produces the instability rather than the local surface heating. A forecaster in 1925, even one not constrained by the ban on the word tornado, would have been working from a pattern recognition framework built primarily on the afternoon storm paradigm. The Tri-State Tornado's parent system did not fit that paradigm. The morning was wrong. The sky was wrong. The wind behavior was wrong. Everything looked like a rainy March day rather than an outbreak, right up until the moment when a wall of darkness emerged from the southwest and proved that the appearance had been deceiving. The 2013 research project that specifically examined the meteorological context of the tri-state tornado, led by Robert Maddox, Charles Doswell III, and their co-authors, analyzed the synoptic and mesoscale conditions on March 18, 1925, and confirmed the specific features of the large-scale forcing that the available historical data supports. The research also specifically examined the question of whether the 219-mile track represented a single continuous tornado or a family. The conclusion was that the evidence was insufficient to definitively resolve the question. The track from Ellington to Indiana was documented in contemporary accounts as continuous, and contemporary observers described a single persistent vortex. But the sparse observation network of 1925 could not have detected brief surface touchdowns in the unpopulated sections between communities, and the tornado's behavior in those intervals is not directly observable from the available record. The 219 miles of path may represent one tornado, or it may represent several tornadoes from the same parent supercell. What it definitely represents is 219 miles of destruction that no other tornado track in American history has approached. The tri-state tornado's formation is documented as occurring near Ellington, Missouri, at approximately 12:45 to 10 p.m. CST. Formation is itself a complicated word in the context of this specific event, because one of the enduring scientific disputes about the tri-state tornado is whether it was in fact one continuous tornado from Ellington to Indiana, or a family of tornadoes produced by the same parent supercell, a series of touchdowns that the contemporary observation network was too sparse to distinguish. Research published in 2013 specifically examined the track continuity question and found no definitive resolution. The evidence is insufficient to firmly establish one interpretation over the other. What is beyond dispute is that something violently destructive, large, and fast-moving tracked 219 miles from southeastern Missouri to southwestern Indiana over 5 hours on the afternoon of March 18, 1925, the 219-mile track is the longest tornado path ever recorded. The record has not been approached since. The second longest confirmed single tornado track in the United States record is substantially shorter. The tri-state tornado's 219 miles represents not just a record, but a category, an event with no successor in the documented history of American tornadoes in the more than century since it occurred. The forward speed that produced this record is the specific feature of the tri-state tornado that most directly determined the scale of its human toll, and the feature that makes it the specific opposite of, say, the 1997 Jarrell, Texas F5, which killed 27 people by moving at walking speed over a fixed location for 3 minutes. Jarrell's danger was dwell time, the accumulation of violence at a single point. The tri-state tornado's danger was something different, the combination of extreme wind speed with extreme forward speed, so that the violence came to each new town fast and with no preceding awareness of what it was. The tornado moved at an average speed of 62 miles per hour across its 219-mile path, with a peak speed estimated at 73 miles per hour in some sections. These numbers require context. Most tornadoes move between 20 and 40 miles per hour. The fastest violent tornadoes in the modern record have moved at speeds above 60 mph, but only briefly. The Pilger, Nebraska tornado of 2014 was recorded at 94 mph forward speed, the highest measured for a violent tornado, but only for a short segment of its path. A tornado sustaining 62 mph as its average across a 219-mile track for 3.5 hours is doing something that tornado science had never fully measured before and has not fully measured since. What 62 MF means for the communities in the path is this. A town located 5 miles ahead of the tornado has roughly 5 minutes between when the storm might become visible to an alert observer with a clear sight line to the southwest and when it arrives. At 73 MF, the peak speed in the fastest sections, 5 miles, translates to roughly 4 minutes. In 1925, with no warning system, no radio broadcasts reaching rural Illinois in real time, no telephone network capable of rapid community-wide notification, and no institutional expectation that a tornado might arrive on a rainy March morning, 4 to 5 minutes was not enough time to protect anyone who had not already identified the threat and initiated protective action. Modern emergency management considers a lead time of 10 minutes the bare minimum for meaningful public protective action. Enough time for people to receive a warning, process its implications, make a shelter decision, and execute that decision. At 62 MF, the tri-state tornado would cross that 10-minute distance in approximately 10 miles. A community 10 miles ahead of the tornado, receiving a warning at that moment, would have 10 minutes. A community 5 miles ahead would have 5. A community in the tornado's direct path with no warning system would have whatever time elapsed between seeing something dark to the southwest and being inside it. In communities that experienced the tri-state tornado, survivors described what they saw in terms that reflect this specific challenge. The very wide tornado at very high forward speed does not look like a tornado to an observer positioned in its path. A narrow funnel approaching from the southwest has a shape that registers as a recognizable severe weather threat, the visual signature of a tornado that the cultural awareness of tornado country in the 1920s had partially documented. A tornado that is 3/4 of a mile to more than a mile wide, approaching at 62 miles per hour in the rain, looks like the sky itself coming toward you. It looks like a wall of weather, not a distinct storm feature. There is no time to categorize it, to apply the mental framework of tornado with its associated behavioral response, before it arrives. All they had was they looked off to the west and went, "Looking a little dark out there," and didn't even know what it was until it was right up on them and then you're scrambling to find shelter, is how one 21st century account of the tri-state tornado characterizes the warning experience available to communities in its path. Scrambling for shelter in a wood frame structure with no basement, against an F5 tornado at 300 MF wind speeds and 62 MF forward speed without any prior warning, is not a survivable situation in the core of the path. For many communities along the tri-state tornado's track, the warning was the event. The tri-state tornado began in Missouri and ended in Indiana. Between those 2 points, it crossed through 3 states, 14 counties, and more than 19 communities, leaving a track of destruction that the contemporary press struggled to describe in terms adequate to its scale. In Missouri, the tornado killed approximately 11 to 13 people. This relatively modest toll compared to what followed in Illinois reflects the rural and sparsely settled character of the southeastern Missouri landscape at the point where the tornado was developing and intensifying. The tornado touched down in Reynolds County and moved rapidly northeastward through the Ozark Plateau terrain before reaching the more level agricultural country where its full destructive capacity would be expressed. The town of Annapolis, Missouri, a small community of a few hundred people, was struck near the beginning of the tornado's track when it was still intensifying. Approximately 90% of Annapolis's structures were destroyed. 2 people died. For a community of its size, this was catastrophic. For a town in the path of what the tornado would become, by the time it reached Illinois, It was the relatively limited impact of a storm that was still building toward its peak. Debris from the Annapolis area was found as far as 50 miles away, lifted into the tornado's upper circulation and carried by the upper-level winds to communities that had no knowledge of what had sent the debris their way. The Mississippi River did not slow the tornado. When the tri-state tornado crossed the Mississippi River into Illinois, it entered the most densely populated terrain of its path and began producing the deaths that make it the record it is. Southern Illinois in 1925 was coal country, a landscape of small cities supported by coal mining operations and the manufacturing that coal power supported. With populations concentrated in communities that sat directly in the path of what was coming from the southwest. The tornado crossed the Mississippi and almost immediately struck Gorham, Illinois, a small community of a few hundred people whose residents recalled the morning as ordinary and gray, who had no warning of what was about to happen, and who experienced the tornado as many towns in the path did, as a darkness that arrived before it could be categorized. The tornado crossed into Indiana in the later and somewhat weaker phase of its track. The Indiana communities struck, Griffin, Owensville, Princeton, experienced an EF5 equivalent tornado in its diminishing phase, which still meant catastrophic damage and dozens of deaths. Indiana's death toll of approximately 71 to 91 people, while dwarfed by Illinois' 591 to 613, is itself a significant event by the standard of any individual state's tornado history. The tornado dissipated near Petersburg in Pike County at approximately 4:30 p.m. ceased after nearly 3 hours and 40 minutes of continuous ground contact. The aggregate death toll by state: Missouri approximately 1113, Illinois approximately 591,613, Indiana approximately 7191, reflects both the specific intensity of the tornado at different points in its track and the specific population density of the terrain it crossed. Illinois bore the overwhelming majority of the deaths because Illinois' southern coal belt had the densest concentration of communities directly in the tornado's path during its peak intensity phase. The specific geography of where the tornado was most violent intersected with the specific geography of where the most people lived. And the result is the asymmetric death toll that makes Illinois still the record holder for the most deaths in a single state from a single tornado event. Gorham was a small community of a few hundred people. The tornado killed over half of its population. The specific damage at Gorham, documented by contemporary survey teams, established patterns that would be seen repeatedly along the Illinois path. Complete structural removal of residential buildings, deaths of people who had sought shelter in the most substantial interior spaces of their homes, the absence of large debris in the most violently struck zones. The pattern continued northeast through Illinois with a relentlessness that the subsequent centuries' worth of tornado records has not replicated. DeSoto, Illinois, Murfreesboro Parish, West Frankfort. Benton. Each community suffered in sequence, separated by the minutes that the tornado's 62 mph forward speed allowed. Murfreesboro, Illinois, is the specific place where the tri-state tornado wrote its most devastating chapter. The city had a population of approximately 11,000 people in 1925, a working-class mining city with a downtown commercial district, residential neighborhoods fanning outward from the city center, and the specific built character of an Illinois river town whose economic life was tied to the coal seams beneath the southern Illinois landscape. The tornado struck the northern portions of the city with its full destructive force. 234 people died in Murfreesboro. 234 is a number that requires a moment. It is the most deaths in a single community from a single tornado in the recorded history of the United States. By comparison, the Joplin EF5 of 2011, the deadliest tornado of the modern warning era, killed 161 people across a city 3 times Murfreesboro's size, with a warning system in place, with survivors who had 20-plus minutes of warning and made shelter decisions based on that warning. Murfreesboro's 234 deaths came with no warning in a city of 11,000, which means the tornado killed more than 2% of the city's entire population in a single pass. 40% of Murfreesboro was destroyed. The destruction was not confined to one neighborhood or one zone. It moved across a wide section of the city, eliminating blocks of residential structures, damaging the downtown district, striking school buildings during school hours. The fires that broke out in the tornado's aftermath, gas lines severed in structures reduced to kindling, burned for hours. The Murfreesboro Fire Department, its capacity already overwhelmed by the scale of structural collapse, was fighting fires in debris fields on the same streets where rescue teams were simultaneously searching for survivors. The smoke rose over the ruins for the better part of a day. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which dispatched reporters to cover the disaster, described conditions in Murfreesboro in terms that the subsequent century of tornado coverage has not substantially exceeded in directness. Boards, poles, cans, garments, stoves, whole sides of the little frame houses, in some cases the houses themselves, were picked up and smashed to earth. And living beings, too. A baby was blown from its mother's arms. A cow, picked up by the wind, was hurled into the village restaurant. West Frankfort, Illinois killed 127 of its residents. The community had a population of approximately 12,000 and was, like Murfreesboro, a coal mining town whose residential construction was predominantly wood frame without basements. The tornado's path through West Frankfort struck during afternoon hours when a significant proportion of the working-age male population was underground in the mines, an incidental factor that may have reduced the death toll, since people working below the surface in the mine shafts were physically below the tornado's destructive zone, while their homes above were being destroyed. The mining context of the southern Illinois communities struck by the tri-state tornado is relevant to understanding both the specific physical environment the tornado found and the economic devastation that followed the physical destruction. The coal mines that employed much of the workforce in Murfreesboro, West Frankfort, and the surrounding communities depended on the above-ground infrastructure, the buildings, the equipment, the roads, the communication systems that the tornado destroyed. The economic disruption extended beyond the immediate loss of homes and lives to include the productive capacity of a regional economy that the tornado had dismantled. Gorham, Illinois is the community that most completely documented what happens when a town of modest size sits directly in the center of an F5 tornado's path with no warning. The town had a population of approximately 500 people. The tornado killed over half of them. The specific proportion, more than half the population of a community dead from a single tornado, has not been replicated in a comparably sized U.S. community in the century since. Gorham's survivors described a tornado they did not recognize as such until it was on them. The wide, roaring darkness that arrived from the southwest without warning, and that a 500-person community had no mechanism to communicate even among its own members before the storm struck. 9 schools were struck and destroyed by the tri-state tornado across the 3 states. 69 students were killed. The specific tragedy of school buildings struck during school hours is a feature of the 1925 event that the modern tornado preparedness infrastructure has specifically and deliberately addressed in the centuries since. School tornado drills are a legal requirement in tornado-prone states. School building design standards specify interior reinforced rooms or designated sheltering areas. The protocols in place today at most U.S. schools exposed to tornado risk would, under most circumstances, have most students in interior locations away from windows and exterior walls within the time that modern warning lead times provide. In 1925, school buildings in rural Illinois and Indiana were wood frame structures with no particular design standard for tornado resistance. The shelter protocols available to students and teachers were the same protocols available to everyone else in 1925. Go to the most interior room of the building and hope. For some students, in buildings that were struck by the tornado's outer circulation rather than its core, this was sufficient. For the 69 who died, the interior room was inside the structure that the tornado's core circulation simultaneously dismantled. The specific legacy of the tri-state tornado for school tornado preparedness is one of the more concrete lineages in the history of tornado safety policy. Modern school tornado drills were not a standard requirement before the wave of severe weather events in the 1950s prompted state-level legislative action. But the specific argument that schools were vulnerable, that the concentration of children in buildings during hours when violent tornadoes could strike, was a specific and unaddressed risk, gained much of its force from the documentation of what happened to those 9 schools and 69 children in 1925. The Illinois communities of the tri-state tornado path have been rebuilding and living with this specific day for a century. In some cases, they have not fully recovered to their pre-1925 demographic trajectory. Murfreesboro's population in 2020 was approximately 7,600, substantially below its 1925 population of approximately 11,000. Whether the tornado's disruption to the city's economic development contributed to this long-term decline is a question that economic historians have studied without definitive resolution. What is clear is that the specific communities that bore the most direct impact in Illinois experienced a disruption that extended well beyond the immediate years of rebuilding. Some rural communities that the tornado struck in 1925, communities of a few hundred people that had over half their populations killed, never returned to their pre-tornado character at all. The tornado crossed from Illinois into Indiana and struck the southwestern Indiana communities of Griffin, Owensville, and Princeton. Indiana's death toll, approximately 71 to 91 people, was lower than Illinois' by an order of magnitude, reflecting both the tornado's gradual weakening as it traveled further from its peak intensity in central Illinois and the somewhat lower population density of the southwestern Indiana communities it struck in its final hour. The tornado dissipated near Petersburg in Pike County, Indiana at approximately 4:30 p.m. CST. From Ellington to Petersburg, 219 miles, 3 hours 30 minutes. 695 direct deaths from the tri-state tornado alone. 747 deaths total across the March 18 outbreak. More deaths in a single afternoon from tornadoes than any afternoon in American recorded history before or since. And in the entire 3 hours and 30 minutes that the tri-state tornado was on the ground, the United States Weather Bureau issued no tornado warning for any of the communities in its path. Because it could not. Because the word was banned. The history of the tornado warning ban is one of the stranger stories in the history of American science and public policy. It begins with a specific argument made in the 1880s by the leadership of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, which at the time administered federal weather services, about the relationship between tornado information and public behavior. The argument was that tornado forecasts would produce panic, that the word tornado, communicated to the public, would cause people to flee in ways that created more casualties than the tornado itself would produce through direct action. The fear was stampedes, accidents, the disruption of commerce and travel. This argument was made and accepted, and the ban was instituted, without any empirical basis in the form of evidence about what happened when people were warned about tornadoes versus when they were not. It was a theoretical argument about public psychology, made by institutional leaders who were more concerned about the political consequences of public panic than about the scientific question of whether warning people about tornado threats saved lives. The evidence of what happens when communities receive tornado warnings, the specific comparison between warned and unwarned populations, was not available in the 1880s because tornado warnings had not been systematically issued. The Signal Corps made a policy decision based on an assumption about human behavior that foreclosed the possibility of accumulating evidence to test the assumption. The ban remained in place in various forms for decades. Even after the word tornado was gradually rehabilitated in Weather Bureau communications in the 1930s and 1940s, the operational infrastructure for issuing tornado warnings to the public did not exist until the late 1940s and early 1950s. The first successful tornado forecast in U.S. history was issued on March 25, 1948, by Captain Robert Miller and Major Ernest Fawbush at Tinker Air Force Base near Oklahoma City, 23 years after the tri-state tornado. A tornado had struck Tinker 5 days earlier. Miller and Fawbush recognized that the atmospheric conditions on March 25 resembled those of March 20, and they forecast a tornado for the Tinker area. A tornado struck Tinker that evening. The forecast was correct. The Air Force's willingness to issue a tornado forecast and act on it, something the Civilian Weather Bureau was still institutionally reluctant to do, marked the beginning of the operational tornado warning system that has been built and improved in the 7 decades since. The modern NWS issues tornado watches and warnings as a standard operational function. The average lead time for an EF3 or stronger tornado warning, the time between the issuance of the warning and the tornado touching down, was approximately 20 minutes as of 2024, based on data from 2008 to 2024. That 20-minute figure represents the accumulated knowledge of 75 years of systematic tornado forecasting, Doppler radar development, mobile radar programs, social science research on warning communication, and the operational iteration of a warning system that has been tested, evaluated, and improved continuously since the late 1940s. 20 minutes. Against the Tri-State Tornado Zero. The specific counterfactual of what a 20-minute warning system would have done to the Tri-State Tornado's death toll is not a simple calculation. And the answer is not simply 695 would have become 0. The buildings in the path in 1925 were no more resistant to F5 winds than the buildings in the path of Joplin's EF5 in 2011, and Joplin killed 161 people despite a warning system, despite radio and television broadcast capability, despite the full communication infrastructure of the 21st century. A 20-minute warning for Murfreesboro on March 18, 1925, would have reached a city whose residents had no storm shelters, whose basements were no deeper or better reinforced than the basements of 2011 Joplin. and whose wood frame housing stock would have failed under F5 winds regardless of whether its occupants had 20 minutes of advance notice or 0. But the specific mortality pattern of the tri-state tornado, the fraction of each community's population that died, is substantially higher than the modern record at comparable scale. Murfreesboro lost more than 2% of its population. Gorham lost more than half. West Frankfort lost 1%. Modern violent tornadoes striking comparably sized communities with comparable population densities have not produced mortality rates of this scale, even in the hardest hit events. The warning system does not make buildings survive F5 winds. What it does is give some fraction of the population the opportunity to get out of the buildings, to move to below-grade shelter. To make a protective decision before the tornado is the only thing happening. For the fraction of the population in the structural failure zone that has access to a basement or a below-grade shelter, a 20-minute warning can be the difference between survival and death. For those in mobile homes or lightweight structures with no below-grade option, even 20 minutes is insufficient for the survival probability to approach certainty. The 1925 death toll is the product of zero warning, of the policy decision made 40 years before the tornado that foreclosed any warning. Interacting with a tornado of extreme violence, extreme size, and extreme forward speed, in a densely populated landscape where the communities had no realistic way to know what was coming until it was on them. The counterfactual of a modern warning system applied to the 1925 scenario. NEXRAD radar detecting the mesocyclone forming over Reynolds County, Missouri, a tornado warning issued for Gorham, DeSoto, and Murfreesboro, with 15 to 20 minutes of lead time, would not have saved everyone. But the specific mortality rates that make the tri-state tornado unique in the American record almost certainly would not have been what they were. The NUs marked the 100th anniversary of the tri-state tornado in March 2025 with formal retrospectives, public communications, and a specific statement from the agency situating the event in the context of the warning system's development over the past century. The agency statement included the current statistic that the average lead time for EF3 plus tornado warnings in the 2008-2024 period was approximately 20 minutes, a figure that the NWs contextualizes explicitly against the 0-minute lead time of March 18, 1925. The 100-year mark is not an occasion for congratulation. It is an occasion for accounting, for measuring what the century of work has produced, and for acknowledging how much of what was built because 695 people died without any of it. The global context of the tri-state tornado's death toll situates it in a specific ranking that reveals how unusual it was even by international standards. The deadliest tornado in world history is the April 26, 1989 Daulatpur Saturia tornado in Bangladesh, which killed approximately 1,300 people. Bangladesh experiences violent tornadoes regularly. The country sits in a region where the specific combination of terrain, atmospheric dynamics, and population density produces frequent violent tornadoes in a landscape with a population density that exceeds 1,000 people per square kilometer in many areas. The specific death toll of the Daulatpur Saturia tornado reflects what happens when a violent tornado strikes one of the most densely populated landscapes on Earth without a warning system comparable to what the modern NWs provides. The tri-state tornado's 695 deaths is the second highest single tornado death toll in world history. The second deadliest U.S. tornado by death toll is the 1840 Natchez, Mississippi tornado, which killed approximately 317 people, less than half of the tri-state tornado's toll. The Natchez tornado struck a city during a period when river traffic concentrated large numbers of people on boats along the Mississippi River, and much of the death toll came from vessels that the tornado capsized or swamped. It remains the second deadliest U.S. tornado. The gap between 317 deaths and 695 deaths is the specific scale of the tri-state tornado's magnitude above the rest of the American record. The tri-state tornado killed more than twice as many people as the next deadliest American tornado. It is not close. The March 18, 1925 tornado outbreak was the deadliest tornado outbreak in U.S. history, a record it also still holds. The 747 deaths across the full outbreak make this the deadliest single tornado day in American history, by a margin that the April 27, 2011 super outbreak 316 deaths did not approach. The 1925 tornado season itself was the deadliest tornado year in U.S. history, with the March 18 outbreak accounting for the majority of a year's total that exceeded any other year in the modern record. These are not abstract rankings. They describe the specific magnitude of an event that occurred within the living memory of people who are now gone, in a country that looked substantially different from today. Less dense in some areas, more dense in others, uniformly without the warning infrastructure that has since been built. The 100th anniversary of the tri-state tornado in March 2025 was marked by retrospectives from the NWs, by museum exhibitions in the affected communities, and by the specific recognition that the warning system that has been built in the century since the 1925 event is, in the most direct sense, a monument to the 695 people who died without one. The specific combination of factors that produced this outcome, a very wide, very fast, very long-track tornado in a densely populated landscape with no warning, has not been replicated since 1925. Modern tornadoes of comparable intensity have tracked through less densely populated terrain, or moved more slowly, or struck communities with warning systems, or some combination of these. The 1999 Bridge Creek Moore F5 moved at approximately 20-30 inf and killed 36 people in the Oklahoma City metro area, a densely populated modern suburb with a warning system, Doppler radar, broadcast media, and cell phones. The 2011 Joplin EF5 killed 161 people with a warning system in place. The specific alignment of factors that produced 695 deaths in a single event has not recurred. And there is at least some evidence that the warning system's existence is part of why it has not. But the specific physics of the tri-state tornado's forward speed, 62 mph average, 73 mph peak, means that even a modern warning system would have faced specific challenges with this event that more slowly moving tornadoes do not pose. The NW's issues tornado warnings based on detection of rotation signatures in Doppler radar data and on storm spotter reports. The radar scan cycle of a NEXRAD radar provides an updated image every 4 to 6 minutes under standard operating conditions. A tornado moving at 62 mph travels approximately 4 to 5 miles in each radar scan cycle, meaning that the radar-based picture of where the tornado is always shows where it was 4 to 6 minutes ago. For a community 5 miles ahead of the tornado, the radar says it's safe when the tornado is already there. The specific combination of fast forward speed and large width that characterized the tri-state tornado, a mile-wide circulation moving at 62 mph, produced a hazard zone that the modern observation network would find challenging even with all its advantages. The dual polarization Doppler radar, the mobile research radars, the storm spotter networks, the warning dissemination systems, All of these help. None of them fully resolve the specific challenge of a very large, very fast tornado moving through a densely populated area. Because the physics of information propagation and human response time imposes constraints that technology can improve but not eliminate. The tri-state tornado is a limiting case that illustrates those constraints. In the modern warning framework, the 20-minute average lead time for EF3 plus tornadoes is a statistical average that conceals enormous variability. Some warnings are issued with 30 or 40 minutes of lead time for well-organized supercells in clear air environments where the rotation signature is detectable early. Some warnings are issued with 0 or negative lead time after the tornado is already on the ground and has already caused deaths for rapidly forming tornadic systems in complex environments. The tri-state tornado, with its fast-forward speed and its synoptically unusual formation environment, would have been at the harder end of this distribution even with modern tools. This is not an argument against the modern warning system. The 20-minute average lead time for EF3 plus tornadoes is a genuine life-saving achievement compared to the 0-minute lead time of March 18, 1925. It is an argument for honest assessment of what the warning system can and cannot do, and for continued investment in the research and operational improvements that extend the leading edge of what is achievable. The news today uses a dual polarization Doppler radar network that detects the rotation signatures of developing supercell thunderstorms and identifies potential tornadogenesis before the tornado is visible. Mobile Doppler radars deployed by research programs like Vortex and Vortex SE provide close-range data on tornadogenesis that the fixed network cannot. Social science research on warning communication, how warnings are worded, how quickly they are broadcast, what actions specific warnings prompt, has been incorporated into the impact-based warning language that the NWS now uses for the most violent events. The infrastructure that produces the 20-minute average lead time for violent tornado warnings is the product of 75 years of specific effort to do what the United States government was prohibited from attempting on March 18, 1925. The 219-mile track is the longest tornado path ever recorded. The record has not been approached since. This is worth dwelling on specifically because tornado records in other categories have been approached and broken since 1925. The 1999 Bridge Creek Moore F5 produced wind speeds measured at 301 mph by mobile Doppler radar, approaching the tri-state tornado's estimated 300 mph winds. The 2013 El Reno EF3 produced a width of 2.6 miles that exceeded the tri-state tornado's approximate 1-mile width. Various other tornadoes have approached or exceeded specific individual metrics that the tri-state tornado established, but the 219-mile track has not been approached. No tornado documented in the century since 1925 has traveled continuously across more than 150 miles, let alone 219. The specific combination of atmospheric conditions, parent storm longevity, and favorable terrain that produced a tornado capable of maintaining ground contact for 219 miles has not recurred in a way that modern observation could document. Whether the 219 miles was physically one tornado or a family is a question the scientific record cannot finally answer. But the 219-mile path of destruction, whatever produced it, is documented in the physical evidence left across Reynolds County, Missouri, through 14 Illinois and Indiana counties to Pike County, Indiana. The destruction is real. The 219 miles of it are real. The 695 people killed along those 219 miles are real. The tornado had no official name when it struck. Tornadoes in 1925 were not named. They were described by the cities they destroyed, the dates they occurred, or the states they crossed. In the aftermath, it became known as the Tri-State Tornado, named for the 3 states it crossed, the most geographically expansive way to identify the most geographically extended tornado in American history. The name has lasted a century. The record has lasted the same length of time. In the morning of March 18, 1925, it rained. The sky was dark, the air was heavy and still, there was no wind. At approximately 1 p.m., something formed near Ellington, Missouri, that traveled 219 miles in 3 hours and 30 minutes and killed 695 people along that path, with 52 more dying from the other tornadoes the same outbreak produced. The record is 747 deaths on a single afternoon. The record still stands. No one was warned. And in the century since, in the 75 years of systematic tornado warning development, in the Doppler radar networks and the dual polarization upgrades and the mobile research radars and the behavioral science of warning, communication and the school tornado drills and the community shelter programs and the building code standards, and the 20-minute average lead time that the news now provides for the most violent tornadoes, all of it, every piece of the infrastructure that exists to warn people that a tornado is coming, is the answer to March 18, 1925. The answer to what happens when the word is banned. The answer to what 695 people without warning, on a rainy March afternoon, cost a country that had decided the word was too dangerous to use.